In the vast open landscapes of the Somme, near to the village of Flers, tanks were used for the first time in September 1916. But here too an English Earl led his men into their first battle and was killed, and the ground on which he was buried became known locally as the Colonel's Field. What links this part of the old front line to Yorkshire, and who was this English Earl? We begin this week in the heart of the village of Flers, on the road that runs from Longueval near Delville Wood, right through the village and onwards to Ligny-Tilloy. Flers gives its name to the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, which took place in this area on the 15th of September 1916, when British, Canadian and New Zealand forces attacked on a large front from the village of Courcelette on the left, through to Flers roughly in the centre, and across to two woods, Bouleau Wood, Loys Wood, Bully and Lousy Wood, near to the village of Combles on the right. In this attack, tanks were used for the very first time as part of the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps, and here at Flers, on this very road that we're standing on now, it was said that tanks were advancing through the village of Flers with the whole of the British Army behind cheering. Well, it wasn't quite entirely like that, and the use of tanks in this very first battle is a subject that we'll return to one day. But we're beginning at a memorial right in the middle of the village of Flers, a very striking memorial, a bronze British Tommy with his Lee Enfield rifle in his hand, steel helmet, looking out straight down that road. And it's a memorial that I first saw on the cover of Rose Coombs' Before Endeavours Fade, which was, in those days, the guidebook to the battlefields of the Great War. It's an imposing, striking monument, and it commemorates the men of the 41st Division. They were the ones who took Flers on the 15th of September 1916, and during this walk we're going to focus on one battalion that served in that division, the 21st King's Royal Rifle Corps, and our walk will take us to the Colonel's Field, and we'll discover who that colonel was and what the story is behind that part of the Somme. But standing here looking at the 41st Division Memorial, who were they? Well, in previous podcasts we have mentioned divisions of the British Army in the Great War, and this was the standard formation by which the British Army fought its battles. An infantry division was a self-supplying, self-supporting, self-contained unit made up of 3 brigades of infantry, 4 battalions in each brigade, so 12 infantry battalions in total, a pioneer battalion, so a 13th Infantry Battalion giving them pioneer support on the battlefields. And on top of that, they were backed up by gunners of the Royal Field Artillery, men from the Royal Engineers, the medical services formed field ambulances manned by the Royal Army Medical Corps. There were Army veterinary troops to deal with the horses within the division, transport from the Army Service Corps, and there were a number of smaller units such as the Army Cyclist Corps that added particular formations within the division itself. It meant that when a division like this, and it comprised at full strength of around about 20,000 men, would move into a sector on the Western Front, it could essentially look after itself, man the front-line positions. It had fire support from the artillery, engineer support from the various engineering and pioneer aspects within the division itself. When it had casualties, the medical units could take care of those, whether they were men or if it was horses, in the case of the veterinary corps. So it was a self-contained unit that operated on the battlefield. Now the 41st Division was a POWs division in many respects, not so famous as some of the others that had some of the northern POWs battalions in. And to give you some idea of the sort of units that were in this division, and this is just a sample of them, 26th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, they were the Bankers Battalion. That's not Cockney rhyming slang for what the rest of the army thought about them, incidentally. They were drawn from people that had worked in the banking profession or in banks before the war. There was also the 32nd Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers. They were the East Ham POWs. There was the 11th Battalion, the Queen's Royal West Surreys, the Lambeth POWs. There was the 23rd Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment. They were the 2nd Football Battalion. So they were a football POWs battalion, one of 2 that was formed from professional and amateur footballers from various clubs across the country. And 15th Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment, they were the 2nd Portsmouth POWs. These POWs battalions were not just restricted to the towns and cities of the north, many in the south and in the Midlands supplied them as well. And then one battalion that we'll look at that I've mentioned, the 21st Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, or the Yeoman's Rifles as they were known. They were sort of a farmers' POWs battalion formed in Yorkshire. So the men that made up this division, a division formed at Aldershot in September of 1915, had done their training, got ready for their preparation for France, and had crossed to France in the spring of 1916 and had gone into the southern sector of Flanders, close to Plugstert and Plug Street Wood, where they had acclimatised to the conditions of trench warfare, put some of their training into practice and learned about the day-to-day activities of trench warfare. They then moved down to the Somme, and the attack here at Flers-Courcelette on the 15th of September 1916 was the first time the division went into action. And of course, as was typical with many of these POWs formations, when they went into battle and suffered heavy casualties, the whole structure of those units and their identity broke down because the originals were killed or wounded and never returned. And as the war went on, although they retained their names, the Portsmouth POWs and the Bankers Battalion and the Lambeth POWs, increasingly they were made up of men from all sorts of backgrounds and from every part of the United Kingdom, particularly once conscription came in 1916. But because this was the division's first battle, this was the obvious place to build their divisional memorial. The bronze, the imposing bronze of this British Tommy, and I'll put some pictures of it on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, was designed by a sculptor called Albert Toft. He specialised in bronze, but he'd also, at the beginning of his career, worked at the Wedgwood potteries. He actually designed quite a few war memorials right across the United Kingdom. This particular one here at Flers was unveiled in May 1932, and the design we see here is duplicated in two other locations: the Royal Fusiliers Memorial at Holborn in London, and also the War Memorial at Oldham in Lancashire. Standing here looking at it, you can see why Rose Coombs wanted to put a picture of this on the cover of her iconic guidebook, it being itself an iconic memorial here on the Western Front. And the little posts that mark the boundary of the memorial all have cap badges of the different units that serve within it. So it's always worth walking up the little path to the little chained off area and looking at those badges. But we'll leave the memorial now. We'll walk past it with it on our left. We'll come to a T-junction, and over to our left it's a house now, but on the corner there for many, many years there was a little cafe, which was always a good retreat to go to when you were walking the Somme in this area. And the owners had quite a collection of battlefield debris, including some bits of tanks that used to be on display in the bar. But we'll turn right here onto a road that will gradually lead us out of the village. This road was marked as Bulls Road on British maps, and it gets sunken the further we walk along it. And the Germans had dugouts here, and probably later on we had dugouts here too. And as we come out of the sunken part of this road, we come into a little valley, and this was an area where the Germans had field artillery and probably before that heavy artillery. Over the years of walking this ground, I found quite a lot of evidence of the German artillery positions here. Unfired shells, some of the containers that shells came up in, German shell cases, steel ones from later on in the war, so the Germans must have had guns here in the 1918 battles of the Somme. And also some older equipment that it was very typical of the sort of gear that artillery units had, that infantry units with more modern equipment didn't carry into battle, such as the older pattern German bayonets, for example. So coming out of the valley, we come up ahead and we see to our right a British military cemetery. And we'll go in, and this is Bulls Road Cemetery at Flers. As you come into Bulls Road Cemetery at Flers, you see that the original burials here make this an Australian cemetery. The Australian Imperial Force, the Australian divisions, served on this part of the front during the winter of 1916-17, and many of the cemeteries in this area were started by them to bury their dead while holding the front line, which was then in the ground beyond the Wallencourt towards the German positions around Ligny-Tilloy and across to the La Transloy Ridge. Vast, vast open fields, no cover, no woods, just these big Sommescapes where the frontline conditions during that winter were truly appalling. It was the coldest winter of the war, when temperatures in the front line dropped to -25. The instances of trench foot in the Australian forces who were here was very, very high indeed. And in many respects, there were far more casualties caused by the elements than by the enemy, by the German army. But there was shelling, and there was sniper activity and trench mortars and rifle grenades, and cemeteries like this one, where by the time the Australians finished their turn in the line here, there was 154 burials in Bulls Road Cemetery. And then after the war, it was selected to become a permanent cemetery, and it was then enlarged. And there are now 485 British graves, 148 Australian, 120 New Zealand, 2 where the unit is not known, and amongst these there are 296 unknown soldiers and 15 special memorials to men known to be buried amongst them. In that original plot is an Australian gunner, Gunner John Dello of the 11th Australian Field Artillery. His parents in Kilkenny, South Australia, named their house Flers after the place where their son had died, and I often wonder whether they ever had a chance to come from the other side of the world to stand at his grave. When you go into the plot at the back of where the Australian graves are, these are the graves moved in after the war. There's quite a lot of men from the different units in the 41st Division, so the lads from East Ham and Lambeth and Portsmouth. There's one of the original tank crews that died in this area, and there's also some New Zealand graves in this cemetery as well. The New Zealanders weren't in the capture of Flers. They were advancing just beyond the village between High Wood and where the village of Flers is located, attacking part of the German switch line defences in that area. But they occupied the ground around Flers following the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, so it became an area in which they lost quite a significant number of casualties in September on into early October of 1916. And one of those buried here is Lance Corporal Albert James Harguest of the 1st Battalion Otago Regiment, who was killed aged 28 on the 25th of September 1916. He was the son of James and Mary Harguest of Mandeville, Southland, New Zealand. Albert was one of 2 brothers serving here at that time. His brother James was alongside him when he was killed. James would go from private to lieutenant colonel by the end of the war, serving at Gallipoli and in pretty much every engagement that the New Zealand Division took part in from the Battle of the Somme to the end of the war, picking up quite a number of decorations for bravery along the way. Being a farmer, he returned to farming after the war. He also was involved in New Zealand politics, and he also retained an active military role, being a brigadier by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. He served at Crete and then in the Western Deserts, where he was captured. He was then taken to Italy, where he was imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp there. But Harguest was one of those men and one of the most senior British and Commonwealth officers to escape in the Second World War. He escaped from the prisoner of war camp, made his way to Spain, got across Spain to France, and the French resistance helped him get back to Britain. By the time he got back to Britain, the D-Day landings were looming close, and the New Zealand government asked him if he would be the New Zealand observer for their government at the D-Day landings. However, very tragically, he had to process the news that his son, Geoffrey, had been killed at Monte Cassino. Geoffrey was a second lieutenant in the 23rd New Zealand Infantry, and he'd been killed in the fighting around the casino post office right in the heart of the town on the 30th of March 1944, aged only 22. The second Harguest to die in the service of New Zealand, the brother in the First World War, and now James Harguest's son at Monte Cassino. Despite this terrible blow, James Harguest agreed to take part in the D-Day landings, and he landed with the 50th Northumbrian Division on Gold Beach on D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, serving right through the Normandy campaign. He wrote, and this is an account that's often reproduced in books about the Normandy campaign, quite a critical view of the performance of British soldiers in Normandy. But he obviously thought a lot of the men that he'd served with, because he came home on leave in August 1944, where he received the news from the New Zealand government that they wanted him to come back to New Zealand to join the war cabinet. He'd left his kit behind in Normandy, and he wanted to say goodbye to the men that he'd served with since the landings on the 6th of June. And when he went back, he got caught in a mortar stonk and was killed. Brigadier James Harguest being the only New Zealand Army soldier killed in the Normandy campaign. New Zealand Army was then fighting in Italy. They didn't take part in these operations. And of course also with the rank of Brigadier, one of the most senior British and Commonwealth officers to die in the 1944 Normandy campaign. So that means there are 3 Harguests commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Albert, whose grave we're standing at here on the Somme battlefields of 1916. Geoffrey, who's buried in Cassino War Cemetery in Italy, having died in the 1944 battle there. And James Harguest himself, who lies in Hotto War Cemetery amongst those deep bocage hedgerows so typical of the area where the men he served with fought in 1944. And it's a story that's always fascinated me and moved me. You know, here was a family that gave so much in 2 world wars. And James Harguest, having seen his brother die on the Somme, had to bear the knowledge of his own son being killed in another great world war. And we can only but speculate as to how he must have felt about that. I've visited all 3 Harguest graves, in fact many times. This one here on the Somme on quite a few occasions when walking this ground. And on trips to Normandy I've stood at James's grave at Hotto, and when out on Ledger battlefield tours and my own trips to Italy, I've visited both the spots where Geoffrey Harguest was killed in the centre of Cassino and also his grave at Cassino War Cemetery. One year, looking at what Ledger battlefield tours I knew I was going to be guiding, I realised that I would actually be at all 3 cemeteries where they were buried in that one calendar year. So what I did is I took samples of earth from every grave and scattered them on all 3 burial sites. So in a little gesture, in some ways, just a small way, the Harguests were united by 3 great battlefields of the 20th century, the Somme, Cassino and Normandy. And of course, the more you delve into the history of the Great War, the more you realise that stories like those of the Harguests, this tragic loss, is something that is far, far from unique. So leaving the cemetery, we'll rejoin Bulls Road. We'll walk back down the road a little way towards Flers village, and then off to our right is Grass Lane, another one of these tracks, and we'll follow that out into the fields and stop and look at the battlefield of the 15th of September 1916. Standing here on Grass Lane with the village of Flers behind us to our left and looking down this long valley towards the cemetery, AIF burial ground we can see in the distance, we're looking at the ground over which the 41st Division attacked on the 15th of September 1916, but the grounds which the battalion that we're looking at in this podcast, the 21st King's Royal Rifle Corps, the Yeoman's Rifles, this is where they fought. This was a unit that had been raised in Yorkshire in September 1915 by Earl Feversham, the colonel, this English Earl who fought here. Formed at his family seat, Duncan Park, near the village of Helmsley in the North Yorkshire moors, the battalion was raised of 4 companies of yeomen, of men who had largely worked in agriculture on the fields of England before the war. 2 of these companies were raised from men from Yorkshire, 1 was raised from men from Northumberland and Durham, and 1 from Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and Norfolk. So it was considered a sort of a farmer's pals battalion. Not every man was literally a farmer, but these were men who'd worked on the land and expressed that part of England's culture in 1914. The battalion stayed at Duncan Park until early 1916, when it moved down to Aldershot for proper training and then went across to France, served at Plug Street, and then this was their first battle. It's a battalion that's always interested me for one reason and another, and over the years I've turned up some quite interesting information on those who served with it. And I've got a previously unpublished account by a soldier of the battalion, Sergeant Frank Miller, who was from Kiverton Park near Rotherham in Yorkshire. He went on to be awarded the military medal in capturing a German machine gun later on in the war. This is his account of going over the top into this action at Flers on the 15th of September 1916. In a moment, as it seemed, came a deathly lull, and the first lines went forward, not as one imagines, at a furious double with bayonets fixed, but with arms at the ports in a steady plod, the fastest gait possible over such freshly broken and loose earth. Just before the barrage lifted, our post-corporal, or somebody, gave out a mail, and I had a letter from home which I immediately opened and started to read. But the work on hand was too interesting. and I found it crumpled up as a mess in my pocket some days later. I don't know who gave us the order to go forward, but we jumped out of the trench, fixed our bayonets, and then 2 or 3 of us lit a fag each from one match before moving forward. I can still distinctly see our platoon in extended order, Sergeant Jackson in front, but only for a few yards before I saw Yeoman down and scattered in all awful positions of mutilation and death. But our instructions were not to bother with wounded comrades, but just keep going, forward. So forward I plodded. The barrage before us had been perfect, for I have no recollection of seeing a German or even being able to discern the formation of trenches. The ground was just shell holes, lip to lip. But what about the tanks? One kicked off in our left front, but owing to the state of the ground after the barrage, we soon seemed to leave it behind. It was much too slow, and I remember thinking to myself that it would be decidedly unhealthy to stay in its vicinity, because as soon as it surmounted the ridge, it would be in full sight of all the enemy OPIPs and would receive concentrated attention. And this was exactly what happened, as a tank was put out of action on the ridge by a direct hit and was lying somewhere there derelict when I rode over this ground some 12 months later. Into what turned into confused fighting beyond the village of Flers in the switch line, Miller got separated from most of the rest of his battalion, joining them later in the day, and his account continues. I was glad at last to find the remains of our battalion established in some old trenches somewhere in Delville Wood, which was now a haven of rest to us, a mile or 2 behind the new line. Here we were able to have a sort of roll call and get some idea of our casualties. Lieutenant Brooksbank was the only officer in B Company left. CSM Huddleston seemed unscathed. I don't remember that we had a sergeant left at all, for I believe Huddleston had to act as RSM, and I seemed to be the only NCO of B Company left. Here we learned of the loss of our colonel, and worn out as the men were, there was no shortage of volunteers to go back to ascertain his whereabouts and fate. The colonel, the English Earl, Earl Feversham, was missing, and the parties that went out could not find him or his body. The battalion remained in the area for some weeks before being pulled out of the Somme, but in its final moments it was to have the answer. It was to discover the fate of their colonel, their founder. We'll now continue along the lane, walk with the banks on our right, which later became dugouts. This route grass lane was a route to the front line for Australian troops during that winter of 1916-17 when they held the high ground beyond, and soon we'll reach the cemetery, AIF burial ground. AIF burial grounds at Flers is one of the larger cemeteries in this part of the Somme battlefield. There are 2,811 British graves here, 402 Australian, 84 New Zealand, 68 Canadians and 27 South Africans. Of the total number of burials, 2,262 are unknown, which is 2/3 of the whole, so the majority of men who are buried here have not been positively identified. There's also 26 special memorials to men known to be buried amongst them. Over towards the centre of the cemetery, you can see an area of white crosses, and these are 163 French graves covering different years of the war. This became one of the sites on the Somme where French soldiers who had fallen on these battlefields were buried here rather than being taken back to the towns and the villages where they'd come from to be buried in family graves, as was quite common in the post-war period. The cemetery's name, AIF Burial Ground, is the only cemetery from the Great War that contains this reference to what Australian troops were officially called, the Australian Imperial Force, or AIF. The original burials are in Plot 1, rows A and B, and these are the Australian troops who were buried here during that cold winter of 1916-17, when the front lines were beyond Flers, up towards Ligny and around Gurdecourt. These were men killed holding the line, facing the enemy, not in the great battles. But the men that were moved in here for burial after the war, they were killed in the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and when the fighting returned here in 1918, and they come from a wide selection of battlefields. As far away to the north as Serres, there are Sheffield City Battalion men in here who were killed on the 1st of July 1916. There are Canadians from Courcelette, London Regiment men from the fighting around Bully and Lousy Wood, So it's quite a spread of different units and different battles within the main offensive on the Somme in 1916. There's one grave, of course, that we've particularly come to see here, and it is the grave of that English Earl, and we'll find him in plot 3. But this is not where he was originally buried. The original edition of the cemetery register for this area contains a little annotation at the back on the final page, where it says, about 1,000 yards northeast of Flers village, a little to the right of the Ligny-Tilloy road, is the grave of Lieutenant Colonel Feversham, 2nd Earl, Yorkshire Hussars, commanding 21st Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, killed in action at Flers, 15th of September 1916, aged 37. And it's that location, outside of Flers, the Colonel's Field, that we'll walk to now as we leave the cemetery, turn left, walk up to the main Gardecourt road, here turn left again and walk down towards a crossroads, Factory Corner. We're standing now on the crossroads at Factory Corner. Over to our right there's a farm building. Behind that are some ruins of buildings that look like small factories, and these replace the original buildings that were here before the Great War that this position was named after. This was the ground reached by men of the 41st Division on the night of the 15th of September 1916. Very close to here is where they dug in, and many years ago on a Ledger Battlefield tour I officiated over a ceremony that took place here, but that's a tale for another day. What that occasion did do for me, though, was to discover from the mayor of Flers that the field to our left, back towards the village itself, was the Champ du Colonel, the Colonel's Field. This was the name that the locals gave this field, because this was where the Earl of Feversham's field grave was located. Charles Duncombe, 2nd Earl of Feversham, was born in 1879. He was educated at Eton and then Oxford, and he became MP for Thirsk and Malton in 1906. Before the Great War, he joined the Yorkshire Hussars, which was a territorial force yeomanry regiment based in Yorkshire, and he was serving with them when the war broke out in 1914. He went with his regiment to France, and then in 1915 came home, back to the family house, Duncombe Park, and it was here that he raised the 21st Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, in 1915. Being an English Earl and a Yorkshire landowner, it gave him the status that was required to raise this Yeoman Rifles Battalion, this battalion made up of men who worked on the fields of England, who farmed it, who managed it, who cared for it. To him, and probably to them, it symbolised everything they felt they were fighting for, the reason that they had gone to war, to defend old England. And it was in a field as open as any in the North Yorkshire moors from whence he came that Earl Feversham met his fate. His body was not discovered immediately. It was not found until some time after the battle in this area had ended. And we have an account of this from an officer of the 21st King's Royal Rifle Corps, Anthony Eden. Eden would go on to become a politician, just like his commanding officer. He would be Foreign Secretary in the years leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War, and then Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis. Eden published his memoirs, which he entitled Another World, and it described his time in the years before the Great War and his time in the trenches. And this is his account of finding Earl Feversham's body in October 1916. Earlier that afternoon, a gunner officer called in at Factory Corner. Having identified our unit, he gave us unexpected tidings. On his way back from a forward observation post, he'd come upon the body of a dead officer, which closer inspection showed to be that of a lieutenant colonel in a rifle regiment, who he thought had been killed about a month before. He showed us on his map where he judged the body lay. Foljam, the new commanding officer, thanked this officer and assured him that a party would be detailed to bury Lord Feversham that night. He then told me that he must stay with the battalion during the relief operation, and that I should take charge of a small search and burial party and set out just as dawn was breaking. We were pretty confident from the map reference and the lie of the land that we could not be spotted by the enemy, but if we were, and the enemy started shelling us heavily, I was to give up. We must not run foolhardy risks of incurring more casualties. I selected Sergeant Jim Dale, our pioneer sergeant, who had been brought up on the Feversham estate, and who was devoted to Charlie. Bob Ely and 2 other riflemen. Dow contrived during the night to make a small wooden cross from material he'd got hold of, I don't know where, and had carved Charlie's name on it. We set out at our appointed hour and soon found what I judged to be our map reference, but despite a detailed search of the ground, we failed to find the body. It was now getting light, and some desultory dawn shelling began to fall rather too close. I therefore decided that we should make one more sweep, this time a little wider than the previous ones, and if we failed, we should have to give up. At first this fared no better, but just as I was deciding that I must accept failure, one of our party, I think it was Sergeant Dale, who was furthest forward, called out that he'd found the colonel. Then I understood that Charlie had led his men even further towards the enemy lines on that September the 15th than we had thought possible. His body lay on the forward slope of a lip in the ground where he'd fallen, as his and Oakley's weakened battalions advanced upon that next objective, still virtually intact. Sadly, we set about our task. I read a few lines from the burial service, which someone had lent me at the headquarters. Dow set up the wooden cross. We gave our commanding officer a last salute and turned away, leaving him to Picardy and the shells. So it was here that the Earl Feversham was buried, just to the southeast of Factory Corner, in Map Square N25B. This put the grave roughly about halfway between the Flers-Ligny Road and the present location of AIF Burial Ground Cemetery. It was marked by a cross, and in 1926 it was stated this was an oak cross. But the grave did not remain there, as we've seen. It's now in AIF Burial Ground. On the 21st of August 1950, the then Imperial War Graves Commission decided to move the grave. In places like the Somme, a system known as remembrement changes the ownership and use of land on a regular basis, and it could well be that this was behind the decision to move the colonel from his original grave in the colonel's field to where he lies now in the cemetery. This decision was no doubt made with consultation with the Duncombe family, and by 1950 the grave was no longer an oak cross, it was a more permanent memorial. The oak cross had been moved back to Yorkshire, close to the Duncombe estate, and a couple of weeks ago I went to see this original oak cross. It still survives in the grounds of a church near Revo Abbey in the North Yorkshire moors. That part of Earl Feversham's war came home, and as I walked down the lane and into the churchyard, there it was, that little connection to the Somme. These experiences where we can find part of the old front line on our own doorstep, well, it's an experience I sometimes struggle to really define. The connection between here and there and those who lie on these battlefields remains so strong, and in this time where we can't reach out and walk along that old front line, it's good to make these connections and to see these things that take us back to those old battlefields. But as we finish this tale, I finish it not in the words of Duncombe Earl Feversham himself. I stand here at the Colonel's Field, looking out across the Somme, and I'm drawn to the words of Sergeant Carmichael, one of his men, words that come from the unpublished history of the Yeoman's Rifles, written in the 1920s. Presently the order to march at ease came down, and tongues were loosened. Someone in my platoon began singing the verse of a song, and at the chorus the whole company joined in the swelling strain, "There's a long, long trail a-winding." Even now, whenever I hear that wistful song, I can picture the Yeoman Rifles winding up that long, long trail, the battalion at the flower of its strength and the summit of its pride. For me, the mind picture I treasure most of all. Not so many miles away the guns were roaring, paving the way for the sacrifice which the yeomen were to make a few short days hence. But here, in the quiet grey dawn, for me, the battalion is still marching on to the day when I'll be going down the long, long trail with those splendid souls who no longer march in the sight of men. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at OldFrontLinePod. And have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again, along the old front line.